Now that we've configured our switches S1, S2, and S3, it's time to begin configuring the routers. We're going to start our configuration of the routers by configuring the interfaces and bringing up our interfaces. That means we're going to need to configure IPv4 addressing and IPv6 addressing on R2 and R3. We also have serial interfaces that we're going to need to configure, and so lots of interfaces on the routers to configure. We're going to start with that. This is step 3 in my packet tracer activity I created for the CCNA2. So step 3, and we'll start with the host name on the router and then the interface addresses, and then we'll do IPv6 second. So we'll start with IPv4. So I'm going to open up R1 here. I'll press enter on my keyboard to get started, stretch this window out, and the first thing I want to do is type en for enable and conf t to get to global config mode, and let's set the host name of the router to R1. So now that we have the host name configured, we have to figure out which interface we want to configure first. I say that on R1 we configure Gigabit 0/0 first. Now Gigabit 0/0 is a trunk link, so it's connecting to S1 here, and it's a trunk. So it needs to carry all of our VLANs. So we're going to need to set up 802.1q trunking protocol on this link, and we're also going to need to configure sub interfaces because the router is going to need to be the gateway for the VLAN 15, VLAN 25, 35, 88, and VLAN 98. That means R1 is going to be, and if we look over here, you can see it says R1 here, it's going to be Gigabit 0/0.15, so sub interfaces, and it will be 192.168.15.1/24. So we're going to set up these sub interfaces on that interface. So the router is effectively going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 IP addresses on this gigabit interface. It's going to have sub interfaces. Instead of Gigabit 0/0, it's going to be Gigabit 0/0.15, Gigabit 0/0.25, .35, .88, .98. Now, I could have chosen any interface number or sub interface number that I wanted, but I chose .15 so that it matches the network, which is the 15 network, which matches the VLAN, which is the 15 VLAN. And just by matching it, it makes it easy to remember. So if you need to know that if you're in VLAN 15, that it's the 15 network, and then it's going to be sub-interface 15. So it just makes it easier that way. So let's configure that right away. So to configure sub-interfaces on an interface like this gigabit interface, the first thing you have to do is enable that interface. So we'll say interface Gigabit 0/0 to go into it, and then type no shut, and that enables the interface and brings it up. Now we can configure sub interfaces. So I'll say interface Gigabit 0/0.15 and hit enter, and now you can see I'm in sub interface configuration mode. You can also see that the interface changed state to up as soon as I created a sub interface. So now the first thing I need to do is set up the .1q protocol. So I'll say encapsulation .1q space and then a question mark, and you can see now I need my VLAN ID for the VLAN. Since it's VLAN 15, we'll say 15. So now the 802.1q protocol has been set up on that sub interface for VLAN 15. Now I can give it my IP address. There's the IP address, and I'm all set. The interface is already been activated, so I don't have to do anything else. Now we can just quickly do the rest of the sub interfaces. So I'll say up arrow on the keyboard to get back to interface Gigabit 0/0.15, change it to 25, hit enter on the keyboard, up arrow till I get to encapsulation.1q15 and change that to 25. So now the 802.1q protocol has been set for VLAN 25, and then up arrow to the IP address and change that to 25.1. Notice the router is going to be host 1 on all of these networks. Then up arrow to 35, 88 for the management VLAN. And now interface gigabit 0/0.98, we're going to do something slightly different. Hit enter. And then under encapsulation.1q 98, I'll put a space and a question mark, and you can see that I have an extra command that I can put in here, native, to make this the native VLAN. So I'll put that in there. I'll put a space here. So encapsulation.1q 98 native. And then the IP address, which we're going to change to 98. So now I have all of the sub-interfaces configured on interface gigabit 0/0. I'll type exit, and now it's time to configure the serial interface. Now let's take a look at the diagram for the serial interface. So if I minimize that, we look at the topology here, you can see the serial interface on R1 is serial 0/0/0. You can see a little clock here. This means that this interface is the DCE and it needs a clock rate. So we're going to look over here also at R1, serial 0/0/0, 192.168.5.1/30 DCE. So the IP address is going to be 5.1. It's going to need a /30 subnet mask. Notice it says R1 to R2 is the 5.0 network /30 right over here under IPv4 networks. Also, I want to look at the instructions because we're following the instructions, and you can see that on this interface R1 serial 0/0, the clock rate needs to be set to 2 million. All right, so we'll go in here and we'll say interface serial 0/0/0. Now we're in the interface. We'll say clock rate 2.123.123. Set the clock rate, the IP address 192.168.5.1, and then the /30 subnet mask, which is 255.255.255.252, and then the no shut command. And that changes the interface to up. You can see here it says link changed, interface change state to down. Well, that's because R2's interface is down, so this interface is not going to come up until we configure R2's interface. But that finishes the initial configurations, I believe, in step 3 for R1. Yes, that's it. So now we move on to R2 and R3.